taken loads of polls asking Americans how they feel about this election. And the words they come up with, if you put it onto a word cloud, scared, worried, terrified, concerned, all of those sorts of things.
And that is the mentality that has been instilled in Americans since January the 6th. And that is why I say there is so much at stake in this election.
We are going to find out whether America is primarily materialistic or idealistic.
She's an evil, sick, crazy bitch. Oh no. It starts with a B, but I won't say it. I want to say it.
So the good news is he's not, for once, talking about Kamala Harris. The bad news is he's still talking about a Democratic opponent, Nancy Pelosi.
If this election day is about hope versus fear, you kind of know which side Donald Trump is going for. It is polling day in America, and the sun is shining across all the key swing states. Welcome to the Newsagents.
The Newsagents USA.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And it is a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C.
Don't change the subject. You two have just been discussing whether you're going to shave once or twice today. That's how you know it is a really big day in American politics.
Very modern metrosexual men. That's just what we are.
That was a very personal conversation. It wasn't meant for everybody else. As I was saying, it is a beautiful day in Washington, and the weather forecast is unbelievable across all the swing states. That it's looking really good, really warm. A cup of coffee has just gone flying on our live
It's all going very well.
It's all going extremely well.
I think we're sounding mildly giddy, and there's a reason for that, which is the stakes are so high today. Each of us in our own various incarnations will be following and broadcasting the election tonight right through the wee hours, and there is a sort of pinch yourself moment, isn't there? Because American elections are 4 years in the making. None of this sort of snap, shall we have it next Thursday stuff that Rishi Sunak does. They're 4 years in the making, and so you carry with you everything that you've heard and learnt and discussed and thought over the last 4 years, and you have to kind of cram it into one night. Right? The stakes are just ridiculous.
It is momentous. And I was watching both Trump and Harris last night at their closing rallies, both in Pennsylvania, obviously the key state to the election. And you couldn't help but think about the kind of twin paths that are ahead of them for each of them. For Harris, the obvious potential for a place in history which is forever assured. Whatever else she does, she'll have done two things, which she will have become the first woman president. She will always be remembered. She will be this country's Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir, Angela Merkel, whatever you want to say. And she will have been the ultimate foe, if you like, the person who conquered Trump at last, who actually put him to bed, put him into a sealed tomb once and for all. Or she will just be another woman that Trump has beat.
Yeah.
Which, as we were saying yesterday, will probably have a really retrograde, regressive effect on the place of women in this country's politics for a generation. And then for Trump, the prospect of Pennsylvania Avenue or a prison cell.
Yeah.
I mean, it is an extraordinary, astounding kind of twin set of paths before the two of them, and
but also
double futures or different futures for this country.
I mean, look, he's the White House or the jailhouse for Donald Trump, and that couldn't be more momentous as a choice and a direction for the rest of your life, really. The stakes are absolutely huge. I mean, the one thing you can be sure of, look, we've been trying to sense the mood while we've been here. You have got diplomats, ambassadors, who are reporting back to their country's capitals and are saying, we don't know. We just don't know. It's on a knife edge. And I think that more or less everyone along Massachusetts Avenue, where you've got these very fancy embassies, are saying the same sort of thing, that they are hearing contradictory pieces of advice, that no one can agree on anything, that it, you know, all the cliches about it being just wafer thin margins between the two candidates. And an election day, no one ever knows anything for certain until the votes are counted, which always, you know, when Emily, when you say giddy, there's that kind of nervousness, because there is a nervous excitement, fear, tension, all the rest of it.
Yeah, and I think back to Lewis's point, we are at this point going to find out the nature of America. We are going to find out whether America is primarily materialistic or idealistic, whether it is putting the economics that it thinks that Trump will bring. I mean, leave aside the whole question of whether his tariffs are going to, send inflation sky high and basically bankrupt the system. But you're basically going to find out where America's priorities are. And I think that is the most fascinating bit of all. The candidates are the candidates, but it's going to tell us something, I guess, that we will have to understand about the nature of this extraordinarily huge, sprawling, 340 million person population. And I think that's what's resting in here. I mean, to the point about it being too close to call, Nate Silver, who is kind of one of the gods of polling. If you're not called Nate and you're in polling, you're nobody, to be frank, in this country. He ran 80,000 models, sort of formulations of the result, and 40,000 times, just over 40,000 times, I think it was 40,012 times, it came back in favour of Kamala Harris. And 39,000 times it came back in favour of Donald Trump. And then you're left with this potential for a tie. This is not him saying Kamala Harris is going to win the election. This is him trying to tell us that if you run the same thing 80,000 times, there are 80,000 different varieties of results. Kamala Harris may edge it. But it tells you nothing, right? I mean, we've got to this close away from the election, and it tells you the most respected or the most followed pollster in America is still feeling absolutely confused by what, is going to happen tonight.
Yeah, and that's despite the fact that both campaigns together have spent $3.5 billion on this election.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the other thing, which is just astounding. $3.5 billion in the Montana Senate election alone. The Democrats have spent $350 per person on one single race. The amount of money that has been spent is gargantuan and extraordinary. But I think that in terms of, if you're looking at the simulations and you're thinking about what that might tell us, obviously we can't know. But I can say, I do think in terms of, if we're looking at who has got the energy in the last 24 hours of the campaign, which side has the energy, which side looks and sound most assured, it has to be the Democrats and Harris. If you looked at Harris and Trump in their final rallies, Harris looked happy, she looked, to use a word she uses a lot, joyous, assured, huge crowds in her final rallies in Pennsylvania. Trump sounded skittish, anxious, frenzied, as he often does, and his rallies in Pennsylvania, at least, were pretty sparsely attended.
And in rally in North Carolina as well.
Yeah, pretty sparsely
also,
attended.
To be honest, if you're using words like evil and bitch, you're probably not having the best day.
Well, yes, yeah, well,
But
which happens to me a lot.
So, I mean, I think that's another way of framing it. He said in the final rally in Pennsylvania that I'm not fighting Kamala Harris, I'm fighting evil. And you think, oh my word, what a way of framing it. And I think, Emily, the way you have just, is it about the dream of ambition versus fear or whatever? I think it's even bigger than that, this election. I think you really fundamentally, after 2021 and January the 6th, you have got really basic questions about the future of American democracy, the future of America's leadership in the so-called free world among the democratic states, among the liberal democratic order, in a way that we have never faced before.
Well, we are sat right here, not far at all from the Naval Observatory, which is the office of the Vice President, the official home and office of the Vice President. It is currently boarded up.
Well, I filmed it last night.
Yeah.
I drove past it.
There are barricades have been erected all around
it,
such as the fear here of potential political violence, of further civil unrest, in potential anticipation of a Harris victory and Trump's mob descending upon it.
I think it's doing two things. I think it's first and foremost probably telling the people of DC, i.e. the residents, don't worry, we've got this. You're not going to see the same thing as happened on January the 6th. Kind of, we've got this covered and the Civil Guard are on hand if need be. But the second thing is, there is the hint of anticipation of violence.
And
you can't get away
just
from
to
that.
put this in some kind of perspective, in 2016, in 2020, elections before that, you have never seen this before.
Exactly.
What you have had before is that when Inauguration Day happens on January the 20th, security is intensified around the Capitol, around the White House, along the parade route where the President will drive and sometimes walk along Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol back to the White House. you have never seen before. I mean, like where we are now, we're overlooking the White House. Down below us is Lafayette Park. Lafayette Park has been completely screened with fencing that has been erected all the way around. When I drove past the official residence of Kamala Harris last night, the Naval Observatory, there was flatbed truck after flatbed truck full of concrete pillars to erect around her residence. It was like they were getting ready for a siege. And that is the mentality that has been instilled in Americans since January the 6th. And that is why I say there is so much at stake in this election.
I think that is so important because I think that I do think this has become normalized. I think that American elections did not used to be a moment where not only the world but America held its breath in quite the same way that it now does. It never used to be the case. Of course they were turning points, of course they were inflection points, of course they were a moment of decision, of course there will be other countries and Americans who will be deeply unhappy with the result. In the modern era, they have never been associated with the potential of paramilitary violence. And that is what the effect that Donald Trump has had on this country's democracy and its republic. It has become a moment where, look at all of the polls, there's been loads of polls asking Americans how they feel about this election. And the words that they come up with, if you put it onto a word cloud, scared,
terrified,
worried, terrified, concerned, all of those sorts of things. And there are literally, I mean, you will have seen them, right? If you watch TV, you watch cable news, there are ads and there are news items with people advertising, counsellors and that saying, you can talk to your kids, tell them not to be anxious, have an election plan. That kind of nervousness, that imbibed nervousness and anxiety is really disturbing. And let's be honest, it only came from one man, and it's Trump himself.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what doesn't help, actually. What really doesn't help in an American election is the way they count the vote. And that is, every single state has a different approach. Every single state has a different technology. They even have different counting machines. So some counting machines will count 100,000 envelopes, open 100,000 envelopes in an hour, and some will open, half of that or a quarter of that. You will end up having very different speeds of counting depending on where you are. So, we are expecting to get North Carolina through, possibly quite quickly, Georgia possibly quite quickly, Florida possibly quite quickly, because they're more efficient at counting. And what Kamala Harris did last night was she put out a message saying, expect North Carolina and Georgia possibly to be quicker. Do not expect Arizona and Nevada to be quick, which is on the west side. And I think she did that specifically to say, don't start coming out in your droves. Don't start assuming that it's over or it's won or it's lost. Give this whole system patience. And, Arizona may take days. Obviously, none of this is true if it is a very clear winner either way. But if it isn't, what you've got to remember is that Arizona is opening thousands, millions of mail-in ballots, right? Pennsylvania doesn't even start counting the mail-in, the early voting, until the day itself. So you have systems that are really, really smart and efficient in some corners. Parts of the Northeast count very, very quickly. Florida, after 2000, counts very, very quickly. And then you've got these states that just won't, and they can take days. And the word they use here is a mirage, which is you start seeing loads and loads of red votes, and all the Trump fans get excited because they think that he's won, because they haven't then started counting, the other bits of the state or the other counties or the, metropolitan hubs. And so that's when the violence can sort of erupt, is people don't understand that these move in sort of very slow waves.
And the American people don't really understand that, because 4 years ago, the narrative took hold that Trump had won the election and it was being gradually stolen from them as Pennsylvania counted. Yeah. It just wasn't true. The Democrats knew, the leading strategist was telling me at the time, saying, no, I know Trump's 400,000 votes up, but we haven't got our votes out. We haven't got our votes counted yet. You wait and see. If he's only 400,000 up now, we're going to win this state.
To put it in UK terms, it's like you'd count London and then you'd count Lincolnshire. And you will get very, very different kinds of votes. But if you only count London, everyone sort of thinks it's a Labour victory. And if you only count Lincolnshire, you might think that Reform, you'll get very different sort of colours of vote depending on where you're counting.
If we stop the counting in Sunderland at the start of the election night every night, then Labour would always form a government.
By the way, you just mentioned Reform, and I think it is worth mentioning that I think there is a reform bloke out here at the moment, Farage, I think his name is, because obviously the boundaries of Clacton upon Sea do stretch quite a long way west.
I think they'd probably answer that with what were all the Labour MPs doing helping Harris.
I know. No.
Fair dues,
He's a friend of Donald Trump. He is out here, and he gave the most extraordinary interview, I thought, yesterday, where he talked about, to say to Trump, don't fight the poll result.
He said that if Harris wins and Trump loses, then Trump should accept it and go off and play golf.
And obviously that is quite a headline, because Donald Trump until now has not been admitting the possibility of defeat, and he has wanted his friends and his ciphers and those who say they are good mates with Donald Trump to be saying exactly the same thing. And I thought it was telling that Farage used that sort of language about the possibility of defeat, and Donald Trump mustn't contest the result of it.
I thought it was extraordinary, actually, because Farage has never allowed a cigarette paper of space politically between himself and Trump. I've heard him talk about it in explicit terms. He says the reason he has currency in purchase with Trump and the people around Trump is that they know that he's the only kind of foreign or British political figure that basically does not try and detract from him in any way whatsoever.
And Farage got this massive shout out from Trump yesterday, and Farage just stood up and he punched the air with his fist, and he was just delighted, wasn't he?
Yeah, he loves it. He absolutely loves it. So I thought that was very interesting, and indeed interesting as well that he even floated and posited the idea that if he did lose, that Kamala Harris should pardon him for any crimes that he may have committed with regards to January the 6th and so on. Now, I think that is pie in the sky in terms of whether it would ever happen. But the fact that he was floating that, I mean, Farage is a savvy player of these things. I don't think that he would have been caught out by it. It was a very interesting intervention, which to me implied that perhaps, which is something that I felt for the last 24 hours, just looking at Trump and Harris and their body language and how they're talking, something tells me Trump knows potentially that maybe this election is going the wrong way. And
I'm going to
well.
sketch in 30 seconds a fantasy scenario which will seem very far-fetched. It is Trump loses and immediately concedes defeat to Kamala Harris. And there's a back-channel conversation which says, look, I'm going to go quietly. I am going to just spend my time playing golf. But please, can I have a presidential pardon so that I don't have to spend any time...
That's from him. It has to come from Biden.
Yes,
So
of
in
course,
a way,
but
the last act, if this... I don't buy your scenario electorally, but I do get that actually the last act, I mean, the most egregious thing you could now ask Joe Biden to do, the man who's beaten Trump,
is pardon
would be to pardon Trump. Can I just read you one other thing? Talking of sort of British interjections, William Hague is writing in the Times today, and he's basically come out full on for the Democrats. And he says of Trump, he is a serious danger. If Reagan stood for morning in America, Trump is the approach of midnight. Whatever our past affiliations, we should all be Democrats. So he is basically putting himself now on the side, I guess, of the Liz Cheneys. He now is the Republicans for Harris party, because he said, whatever you're thinking, Trump is not Reagan. Trump is not conservative. Trump is not about economic success. He's about darkness. And that's William Hague, the former Foreign Secretary, the former Conservative leader. He is the sort of ultimate grandee, right? Tory grandee.
Well, in a moment, your questions, which we will probably fail to answer. But let's have a go.
Okay, before we get to your questions, and thank you for sending in so many of them, they're really brilliant. While you're waiting for the election results today, please do go and watch on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and we'll put the link in the episode description as well, our special documentary film about abortion in America. We've called it America's War on Women. And it is about the fact that, of course, it's not just Harris and Trump on the ballot today, it is also the right to choose across a series of states. It is extraordinary stuff, the things that we found, and it is really worth watching. It's a sort of extended version of the Friday episode that you heard.
It is an absolutely brilliant watch, and the voices in it are just sort of hypnotising. They're extraordinary. And it's funny, actually, it reminded me, when you say, we think this could be one of the issues that will decide America, that will decide the presidency. And of course, the flip side is that it might not be.
Yeah.
And I was reading this thread, which was from a man who said, I've had a really constructive conversation with somebody who didn't agree with me. And so I sort of read down, I thought, that's interesting. He said, I was wearing my sort of Navy SEAL outfit, military uniform, and the guy next to me said, who are you going to vote for? And so this guy says, so I said Harris. And the guy next to me goes, really? And I could tell that he thought, because I was in military uniform, he was a Trump fan, he was going to go for Trump, and he said, why are you voting Harris? And this guy looks at the person he's talking to and goes, because of the tariffs. And the guy goes, oh, really? He's like, yeah, do you know what the tariffs are going to do? All those tariffs are just going to push up inflation. They're going to make it really expensive for the consumer. It's going to rock the markets. It's going to be terrible. And the guy's like, oh, okay. And he sort of starts to go away and think about it. I mean, maybe the whole thing's apocryphal. You will never know. And what I loved was the comments underneath were saying, why didn't you just say that Trump's a misogynist and Trump's a racist and he's a demagogue and he's going to upend democracy? And the guy goes, because I didn't think that would have any effect. But I did think talking about tariffs might possibly change this guy's mind. And it's so interesting, when we talk about the things that seem really obvious, like what is the thing that fundamentally matters, to millions of women, that will be the only thing they are thinking about tonight, tomorrow, as the result comes in. And to millions of others, it won't even touch the sides, right?
So let us now get to your questions.
Hi, newsagents. Whenever I see coverage of the US elections, whether on social media or on the news, there always seems to be people in these really, really long queues at the polling stations. And in the UK, I've never had to queue for more than 2 minutes. So it always seems strange to me when I'm looking at this coverage of the US elections. So my question is there an explanation as to why they have these really long queues and why they don't just sort that out? And it seems too ubiquitous for the explanation to just be voter suppression or something.
I think the simple answer is that there aren't as many polling stations in America as we do have in the UK in village halls and primary schools and wherever else.
We're really good at polling.
And so you have far more people going to fewer polling stations, which means that you get congestion. Now, obviously, they don't want people. They're only going to let people in when there is a space at one of the voting booths to vote.
Also, ours are open for longer.
Yeah.
Ours are open from 7 to 10. Most American states, which always astounds me. It's less of a problem now because they do so much early voting.
Yeah.
But very often they're only open from 7 till 6:30 or 7 till 7. I like the fact that we do polling day really well.
I do think that we do it better. I think that one system
And
for the
plugs.
whole country where everybody knows what they're going to get.
I mean, that is the difference, to be honest. It's not like Lincolnshire has a totally different
No.
sort of
Electoral
counting system,
Yeah, to Staffordshire or
to
wherever.
Staffordshire. But I think the other thing is, if you remember what happened in 2020, Donald Trump kept on telling people not to trust the mail-in ballots or the voting machines. And so generally, a lot of people vote. No, could they go on the day? Could they go to polling stations? Yeah, of course. A lot of people went on the day itself, precisely because he'd said, don't trust the machines, don't trust the mail-in. They're inventing boxes, they're throwing away boxes, they're setting fire to boxes. And actually, it may very well be one of the things that made him lose last time around. Susie Wiles, his sort of director of comms at Strategy, has been pressing upon him the importance of telling voters that you should trust mail-in ballots, And so I think it may be starting to change now, but I mean, Arizona that we were just talking about is predominantly you mail in your ballots. You don't go to the booths.
That's the big change this time.
Yeah.
I mean, the early voting, as we've been saying all week, is astounding.
Right, next question.
Hi, newsagents. It's Sam from Birmingham, but I live in Kuwait. Huge fan of the podcast. Listen to both Newsagents USA and the regular Newsagents podcast, and have done since the start. I just had a question with regards to surprises. Are there any states in particular that you're expecting to see a big sort of surprise in this election in? And if so, which ones?
Look, I mean, the truth is that it's happened cycle after cycle, is that the possibility of a surprise has become less and less. I mean, if you go back to 2000, there were 15 swing states in 2000. Like, Oregon was a swing state in 2000. Like, in a way, it's kind of incomprehensible now. The fact there are only 7 means that the possibility of a surprise is quite limited. If there is a possibility, of course, and we sort of talked about it yesterday, there could be a blowout for either candidate. Well, there is a world, I think it's an unlikely world, but there is a world where, like, for example, Florida does come into the game, where even, like, she's running close in Texas, and likewise, for him, maybe there's a world where, he's winning Minnesota. This is the kind of, there are paths here, actually, and it kind of feels increasingly more like we're heading in this direction rather than something really tight. There is a path where there is an unexpectedly large margin for one candidate.
I mean, that's the trouble with all the herding from the pollsters, that the pollsters have got us to a place where they're all talking about, margins of 0.01%. The Iowa poll, I think, was our big, it wasn't October surprise, but it was the November surprise.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
And we're going to find out whether Ann Seltzer is totally barking mad or spot on.
I suspect, Sam, if we had answered your question, 4 days ago, 5 days ago, we'd have said, no, it's the 7 swing states and it's all going to be that. And then we got that Iowa poll, and you suddenly start realizing that it's not just Iowa that could come into play, which no one had thought it might. Some people are talking Alaska, some people, as you said, Minnesota. Donald Trump has been to Virginia, thinking that there's maybe a possibility there. Not a hope, I would have thought. He's also been to New Mexico. So, there are places where both camps look and think, in a fantasy world, in our fantasy dream, what we would do, if you're a Democrat, you think, right, we could take Texas, we could take Florida.
I'll tell you what the surprise might be. I'm going to give you the surprise might be that Ted Cruz loses his Senate race in Texas. And that would be a sort of Portillo moment. Not that America will truly understand what a Portillo moment is, but Ted Cruz losing in Texas.
I think it's like a taco.
Could actually be, I would say that would be the moment of the night, whatever happens in the sort of popular vote or the Electoral College.
Hi, newsagents. So given that this election is projected to be one of the closest since Bush v Gore, it sounds like an Electoral College tie is a realistic possibility. In the event of a contingent election, with Republicans having an advantage in the House of Representatives and Democrats having an edge in the Senate, could we really end up with a President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris? And if the two candidates refuse to work alongside each other, which seems likely, what would happen then? Thanks for all that you do with the show. Keep up the good work. Cheers.
So back to the Nate Silver model. There is a scenario that he has highlighted where it does come down to a tie. And in the event of a tie, the House makes the choice. And even though we won't know the House results, probably for days or weeks, it is most likely that the outcome of a tie would end up being a Trump presidency. Would a Trump presidency have a Kamala Harris vice presidency? Not in a million years.
Well, the Senate would decide who the vice president was in that situation, but the Senate is very likely to be Republican after January the 3rd as well. So I think in
a
that
tie
situation
probably lands for
you
Trump.
end up with a Republican.
But it is also entirely possible that a tie would result in so many legal battles that we won't even get to talking about this until January.
I think a tie is a nightmare scenario.
I think if this scenario is anywhere near close, what a great day it is to be a lawyer in America, because you're going to be busy. Isn't it always? Isn't it always?
Or a journalist. We could just move out here. Should we tell the guys back home?
Yeah, that we're just
not coming back.
We're not coming back. We're not coming back.
Well, if there's a tie, we won't.
not coming back.
We're not coming back.
Exactly. That's the Kamala Harris chart.
The Newsagents USA.